I
Here I am.
Here you are, and you're wearing a t-shirt. You look very welcoming. You look very inclusive. Um, all of the
Do
good
I?
things.
I look white as hell. There's that side. Yes.
But you have like the glasses and the beard. I don't know. I feel
Yeah.
safer with you
Oh.
than I feel with a lot of what I'm seeing in the evangelical movement.
Well,
so,
that's fair. I appreciate that. Thank you.
well, you're welcome. Before we hop into it, and because I do want to talk about your background, but I want to paint a picture. If the evangelicals, if Trump gets what they would like to have, what does America look like in 4 years, 5 years?
Well, are you asking like if they get everything on their wish list, as improbable as
Yes.
some of it might be?
Yes. I want all of it.
Well,
Not
just
all of it because we probably don't have that much time, but the TLDR.
before I tell you, I just want your audience to know that everything I'm saying, I have receipts for. Okay, I'm not, but what I'm going to say to you all is not an exaggeration. In fact, I just finished before I talked to you an interview with the NPR reporter who went a year into Christian nationalism to talk to them directly, and everything he said was things that we've been saying for years now. So if the Christian nationalists who are behind the Trump regime get what they want, it looks like Obergefell being overturned. So queer people are quite literally not able to get married, but it goes even further than that. Many of them, and this is a quote, want them to go back in the closet. They want to criminalize just being gay, LGBTQ plus. In their world, the 19th Amendment is repealed and overturned. Women do not have the right to vote. And we go back to what's called the family vote. This is a patriarchal ideal where, as the family unit is set up, according to them, how God intended, which means that men rule over their families, they're the leaders, and women follow, and then children follow underneath both of them. And so why have women vote when it should be a household that gets a vote? So that would happen. It looks like putting blasphemy laws in place. The author of a book called Christian Nationalism, written by Stephen Wolfe, has said on a podcast that atheists are thrown into prison and blasphemy laws are enforced because that's what a good Christian nation should be doing. It looks like a place where white men in particular and those who would assimilate into their patriarchal white supremacist ideology get first pick. And it looks like women are nowhere in leadership. They're not in the workforce. They are not in government. Jewish people are not in government. Muslims are not in government. Atheists are not in government. It is strictly for Christians and Christians only. That's a small snapshot of what they want done if they got everything they wanted with no restrictions. I'll also add one more thing. Many of them want Jesus Christ is Lord written into our Constitution as well.
So that TLDR is terrifying. I'm replacing the T in TLDR with, oh my God, because they're already laying the groundwork for a lot of this. We're already seeing so much of this in action.
Roe v. Wade being overturned was a 50-year-long strategy.
Why don't we plan better?
I marched for life in Washington, D.C. with the pro-life movement as a kid. Like, I used to wear a shirt. I'm not exaggerating. I was 15, and it said in all caps, abortion is homicide. And on the back of the shirt, it had 3 statements. You will not silence my message. You will not mock my God. You will stop killing my generation. I wore that shirt at age 15 thinking I was being countercultural. Okay. This is a bigger picture than just one day some rando extremist got power and here we are. This was set into motion decades ago.
I'm grateful that you're painting this picture of yourself as a true believer because, as you said, you have receipts for all of this. And I'm looking at you and going, this is a normal guy. He seems like a chill, cool person. So how did you go from this belief that we're now seeing widespread throughout America? How did you go from this belief to saying, hey, I want to do something new? You decided to found the new Evangelicals. What was this your calling? What drove you to do this?
Well, look, long story short, a couple of things I want to mention. Number one, I did grow up in the conservative evangelical world. I was homeschooled for 9 years, went to a very small conservative church, went to a small private school after that, really a part of this evangelical, that's the term, psyche. Now, when you're in it, you wouldn't call it evangelical. It's just being Christian, but you're in this world of evangelicalism. And to be clear, it's not like I was taught at age 5, listen, Tim, you have to take over the government one day and overturn Obergefell. It was never that direct. It was little things like you would sing songs about being in the Lord's army as a child. You would learn about how liberals are trying to destroy the country. You would be taught to bring your friends to like these revival meetings to get them saved so they don't burn in hell forever. All these little things that kind of add up to like this world. So I'm someone who was radicalized early on to be a Jesus follower. I prayed a prayer asking Jesus into my heart. I read the Bible. I participated in all the things. I helped plant churches. So I helped start new churches in this evangelical world. I was a professional drummer in that space. What led me out of it, and what led me to kind of start what has now become this organization, which was not the intention, by the way, was that I kept following Jesus straight out the door.
That's
You're
like to a letter. You're like to a T. Like
I read Jesus say, "Love your neighbor as yourself," and then I watched white evangelicals say, "Hey, maybe George Floyd kind of deserved it." And I went, "Wait, what? Like that's not in line with the teachings of Jesus, right?" I read the teachings of Jesus that say you should take care of the least of these and liberate the oppressed. Then I watched Christians I know tell me how that's Marxist and socialist and how, COVID was a pandemic and masking is tyranny. And I went, I don't know, guys. If this is a pandemic killing people, maybe we should do whatever we can to mitigate our complicity in trying to spread this virus around. So to me, this stuff was logical. It was like, wait, guys, you taught me about sexual purity. You told me to wait and save myself for marriage, which I did, by the way. And now you're telling me that the guy on the cover of Playboy magazine, the guy who's grabbing women, the guy who we now know is a sexual assaulting megalomaniac, that's the dude that God has chosen to lead the nation? But I couldn't even serve my church as a volunteer if I was found alone with my girlfriend for too long? Come on. Like something isn't, the math ain't mathing. So those were the things that kind of led me out of it.
So the logic, the critical thinking of it all makes a ton of sense to me, but it seems like part of the evangelical world or the Christian world, which is interesting. I'm glad that you pointed that out, that they don't necessarily view themselves as evangelicals. They say Christians, but part of that world is being told what to do and following that. And so when you were younger, and I've noticed like they like to be told what to do by God and by authoritarian figures, but not necessarily like, hey, wear a mask because people are going to die if you don't wear a mask. So can you talk a little bit about what that is, to be told what to do, to follow a specific set of guidelines only to a specific leader, but then to have it completely be contradicted and still follow this? Because it just seems like what the leaders say and what the book says, contradictions all around.
Yeah. Wow. Yes. Good points. How do I distill this? Well, let's start real big picture. Any kind of religion can be high control, right? This is not unique to Christianity. It's not unique to my tradition, but in America, it's a Christian problem, right? So I call this high control religion. The tradition I grew up in was very high on authority. Who's in charge? Who's your spiritual authority? And usually it's white men who are the pastors of a church, and they're the ones telling you what the Bible clearly says. And the way they do this is by selecting, the term is called proof texts, different Bible verses to then prove why this view is correct. They don't respect the context that verse sits in. They don't respect the culture that the text comes from. They just kind of use it along with other verses to kind of create this narrative. And the narrative usually comes out to be something like this. I'll kind of give the broad picture. Hey, you are a wicked and depraved person from birth. You need Jesus to save you. He paid the penalty for your sin by dying on the cross. If you put your faith and trust in him, you will not go to hell when you die. You'll go to heaven. So that's the theological implications. And then, of course, that's dictated by, you follow the church and you kind of believe your pastor, and then we'll teach you how to become a disciple of Christ. On the culture war issue, it comes out to the Bible is clear on sexuality. The Bible is clear on abortion. And therefore, we have these views because we have what's called is a biblical worldview. But really what that is it's a certain framework for how they interpret a very complicated and oftentimes contradictory collection of ancient texts that have a very long history of how we got them today, right? So they kind of erase all that. They see the Bible as the words of God directly from God's words or God's pen to our eyeballs and ears, right? And all we have to do is read it and we'll be okay. Of course, when you start reading the Bible, you realize there's some pretty messed up parts and oftentimes complicated parts. Like, oh, I don't know, the fact that 4 chapters into Genesis, the first book of the Bible, Lamech, this guy, takes 2 wives. Wait a second. I thought
Yeah.
that you told me the Bible was clear on human
Mhm.
sexuality, and this guy takes 2 wives. So then they have all these kinds of workarounds for why that verse doesn't, isn't really how we live now, but this verse is. It's a very complicated work. But the framework, or I should say, the result, always leads to heteronormative, very white, and very conservative ideals in most cases.
So it sounds like there's a set agenda, and then no matter what happens or what they find in the text, they'll figure out a way to interpret it to reinforce the set agenda that is not changing.
Yeah, so we can say that they have certain presuppositions, and then they
Mhm.
find the foundation to reinforce those presuppositions in the text. Now, to be clear, many of them just think that they're being biblical. They can't even see that they're doing this. I fully recognize, as a more progressive or leftist Christian, that we all pick and choose what parts of the Bible we're going to follow, which parts we don't, and why we do that. And there's a lot of reasons to do that. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but people in this space would say, no, we're not picking and choosing. We're just reading the Bible correctly. We are being biblical. So they can't even see that they're doing the very thing that they think that they're not doing.
It's got to be so frustrating for somebody who is growing up in that world, who starts to see the contradictions and wants to actually be a true follower of Jesus and of Jesus's principles. So, can you take me back to like baby Tim, or like middle school Tim, elementary school Tim, when you were following these principles and you met someone who was, I don't know, what would you guys say, a heathen, somebody who doesn't follow these,
Well,
what
I
do
didn't
we
really
call
meet a
us?
lot of them at that age because my whole world was the church and was my homeschool group. Like, I didn't really meet a lot of non-Christians.
So once you got out of that world and you encountered these people, did you feel sorry for us? Do you feel, how can I communicate to them to get them over to my belief set? Like, what are you thinking? What are the kids now these days that are having those first encounters?
Well, yeah, I mean, okay, so I used to work for a missions organization called Child Evangelism Fellowship. They are the largest missions organization reaching boys and girls with, in their words, the gospel of Christ. And as a teenager, I was taught to do what they call are these backyard or 5-day clubs, where you go with a team of other young adults and you do this like little hour-long program where you do a Bible story and you do songs and games. And the goal is, if the kids aren't saved yet, to get them saved. And so what happens is that at some point you do what's called an invitation. It's funny. As I say this out loud to a more secular audience, I'm like, wow, this does sound crazy, even though to me it feels so normalized. So I realize that, okay, as I'm saying this story. So I would do this Bible lesson. I would say, okay, if you've never received Christ before, but you want to, go ahead and raise your hand. And then kids raise their hand. And then one of my team members or me would take them into this section, like away from the rest of the group. And we have this thing called a wordless book. And it was always different colors. There was a white page, there was a black page, they call it now the dark page. There was a red page, a gold page, a green page, etc. And you would walk them through the gospel presentation. The white represents God's holiness and purity. The dark page represents sin, which of course now I'm like, oh, like there's some like real racist shit in that, right? But I as a kid, I'm just going through this thing. The red page represents Jesus's sacrifice on the cross, how he shed his blood for you. And at the end, I'd want them to pray a prayer so that way they wouldn't be, we would say, separated from God forever, which is our way of saying not going to hell. So certainly I had that view. But as I got older, I was always a curious person. And as I got older and met people outside of my own tradition, I slowly shifted from I have to save you to, well, I'm kind of curious. This is like not how I grew up seeing the world. And what makes you so convinced of your beliefs? Because I know I'm convinced of mine. How does that really work? So that was kind of the slow trajectory.
So I like your trajectory. Uh, the trajectory that scares me is like the trajectory of the Sean Foyts
Oh
of
yeah,
the world.
he's the reason I started TNE. Do you know that? He's the
I did
reason.
not know that.
He was the moment. During COVID, I saw him doing his worship stuff. I was a worship drummer in the church world. And I thought, this worship guy does not represent me. And I was so frustrated with the response to Trump, the response to Black Lives Matter, the response to COVID, that I said, we need like a new evangelical something, a new evangelical movement. That's how I thought of the name. And that's what kind of got us all kicked off.
So, for people who don't know, Sean Foyt is this, he has luscious hair. I mean, that's when I look at him, I'm like, he's luscious hair. He's a good looking guy. He's very charismatic. He's something that people would want to follow. And he was very upset during COVID that people weren't allowed to worship and sing indoors. And so you see him go on this, I don't want to call it a crusade, but it feels very much about like that in many ways.
Yeah.
um, can you talk about, so we've got this divide now, so some people decide, okay, we're going to go and we're going to double down on these dangerous beliefs, and then we have the other side that are going new evangelicals. How now are you, because the impetus, right, is for people like me to look at it and go, well, that's obviously Christian, and that's obviously not Christian. Like what Sean Foyt is doing is not Christian. But I've seen
Mm.
you speak about this, and you said it's counterproductive, basically, to say real Christian versus not real Christian. And you said something about Christianities. Can you talk
Yes.
about that?
Yeah, I like you, I'm sure. I want to be in the business of truth telling, right? I don't want to be hyperbolic. I don't want to say things that I think aren't true and then not be able to defend that. I think the whole notion of they're not real Christians is a fool's errand for a lot of reasons. But I'll give you one or two of them. First is that if you think that Christianity has always been monolithic throughout its history, you're sorely mistaken. The church has been fighting and splitting and arguing over this for years. The Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Protestant Church, they all have their big schisms. So Christianity is not monolithic, okay? And the other point why it's important not to say they're not real Christians is because by all counts, they are. They profess pretty typical Christian beliefs. And also, we have to understand, especially in the American context we live in, there has been a stream of colonizing Christianity that has been part of this nation for a very long time. And it's what Sean and many Christian nationalists are still participating in. This idea that God has given us a right to conquer and colonize and take over and rule whatever land we're a part of, to make America or whatever nation it is a Christian nation. This is Constantine in the early church tradition. This is the Crusades for a lot of reasons. So this is unfortunately, it's an ugly part of the Christian tradition that if we write off as not real Christians, what we're saying is, as a Christian, it's not my responsibility to hold Sean accountable. And that's not fair. It absolutely is my responsibility to hold Sean accountable. It just is, because Sean is doing so much damage in the name of Christ. Now, what we can say is that the beliefs and the actions of Christian nationalists like Sean Foyt are antichrist. They go against the teachings of Jesus. So that's how I kind of parse this out. You can
That
be a
sounds
Christian and believe in
pretty,
antichrist things.
sorry, that sounds pretty like bold, because I thought like to invoke antichrist is worse than saying not a real Christian, but you're
It
saying like
is. That's why I
antichrist
say
is
it.
okay.
Hey, we got to be able to call it what it is. You read the Beatitudes, the teachings of Jesus, and then watch what Christian nationalists do. Just compare and contrast. It's not a lie. They believe and do things that are anti the way of Christ. They are antichrist in nature. One easy way to flesh this out: Jesus in the Gospels, right? The four stories of Jesus. Very clear message of he teaches his followers. He was a persecuted Jew under empire. He teaches his followers to bear the Roman cross for their enemies, right? Hey, you love your enemies as yourself. Christian nationalists believe in erecting and building new crosses to crucify their enemies on. It's a complete distortion. It's the opposite of what Jesus taught his followers to do. So, right there's one easy example of how this Christian nationalist thing that we're all witnessing take a lot of power is completely antichrist.
I want to take my pulse on that one, because like that it feels like such a great tactic, but it feels like a scary tactic to try to use, because right now we're looking at Pam Bondi investigating and coming up with ways to protect the persecuted Christians in America, and so they're setting up this dynamic where they truly are feeling, one, we're persecuted, two, we need laws now to protect us. But I want to talk about what laws mean in this new world,
Can I
right?
say one thing
Because
quickly? Do you mind
yes,
about
yes, of
that?
course, go.
This is why it's on white men to do this shit. It should not be
Mm,
on black women. It should not be
thank
on
you.
minorities. It should not be on queer people. It shouldn't be on atheists. white men like myself have an obligation to take those arrows. Like, yes, Pam, please try and sue my ass. I would love that. I would fucking love that. That should not be on you to do, though. So I want to make that distinction. What I'm saying is for in-house ex-Christians or Christians who grew up in this space to take on, it should not be on the backs of other people to do that.
Thank you, because we are tired. Okay, we
I
are
believe
very,
it.
very
That's
tired.
word on the street is that you're tired as hell. I get that. You know, it's as you know, it's a fine line, right, between like the white saviorism that we can fall into,
Mhm.
and also making not white people do all the emotional labor. So the whole idea is, can we stand in solidarity, learn from each other, and support each other in appropriate ways? I just think that's a really important point, especially for white men to wake up to. Like, you want to stand in the gap. You want to be an alpha male? Start doing that shit. Start calling out the Pam Bondis of the world and calling it what it is.
Like, that's practicing what you preach in my
Mm.
book. Like, that's what
Mhm.
I'm hearing. And so, yes, please, more of that. Um, but laws now are shifting and changing, because when we call out hypocrisy, we say, oh, well, they're no longer the law and order party. MAGA isn't about law and order. But I'm starting to think the laws that they're speaking of are not man-made laws. Like, they don't, do evangelicals believe in man-made laws above God's laws? And do they believe in man-made order? Can you talk about what it looks like in this new world where apparently for the most of us, we're going, what the hell's happening? They used to be back to blue.
Well, look, let's be clear, and this will be controversial to some people who are maybe more religious, but all laws are man-made. The Bible was written by men. Okay, like, we might think God's speaking to us, but they're all man-made ultimately. Like, man makes them. Maybe we interpret them as divinely inspired. That's a different conversation, but that's what we're talking about. However, you are right, though. For the Christian nationalists, it's about, and I want to be a little bit nuanced here, so forgive me to take a minute to flesh this out. Christian nationalism, like many things, is not entirely monolithic. There are definitely widespread beliefs, but they do have some separation. And there are two major factions of Christian nationalism, and they do intersect. But one of them is picking up on a thread laid down by someone back in the 70s named R.J. Rushdoony. And the term we would use here is dominionist or theonomist. And he advocates for replacing American civil law with what he calls his biblical law. So looking at the Hebrew Bible, some people call it the Old Testament, picking some of those sections about stoning women caught in adultery, stoning gay people, and putting that into actual law in America. And that's real. I mean, he wrote prolifically about this. So yes, there are Christian nationalists out there who believe that ultimately they have to be subservient and implement their version of God's law based on the Bible in America. This is why, if you follow what's happening with Ryan Walters in Oklahoma, trying to put the 10 Commandments in public schools, this is like, it's like a conquering tool. Like, look, we did it. These 10 Commandments that we think society should be based off of are now in the public school where kids have to read it all the time. Now, obviously, that doesn't solve the fact that Oklahoma is like 49th or 50th in the nation when it comes to the level of education that their kids get. It doesn't solve our mass school shooting problem. It's simply what they might call is virtue signaling, right? They're just virtue signaling, saying, look, we did it. The 10 Commandments, right? So absolutely, for Christian nationalists, the goal is for many of them to replace our civil laws with what they would call biblical or, God's law, ultimately.
And with Pete Hegseth being in charge of defense now, and he is a Christian nationalist, he has the tattoos that reinforce this. What does that mean now that because I want to talk about immigration in terms of what it means for evangelicals. Like, what do borders look like to an evangelical, and how do we shift people over to the new evangelical view?
Well, a couple of things, and I think you and I kind of bonded over this on Threads. One of my gripes with left wing secular voices, which, by the way, a lot of them are doing important work. I mean, I love Under the Desk News. I love all those folks. Like, they're crushing it. But if you didn't grow up in this world and don't know some of the players, you don't really fully understand what's animating the Trump administration. Now, to be clear, we need both and, right? You need your left-wing political pundits who can help people like me better understand the Democratic Party and what's happening politically. But we can offer an angle like this. Pete Hegseth is not just problematic because he's a drunk or because he abuses women. All bad things for sure. He's problematic because he's part of a church network led by someone named Doug Wilson. Do you know who Doug Wilson is?
He's not.
Yeah, exactly. Doug Wilson is a prolific, now more than ever popular figure in the evangelical right-wing space. He draws from R.J. Rushdoony theology. That's the guy who wants to replace the civil law with the Old Testament. He told me on a podcast, because we interviewed him for research, that he wants Jesus Christ as Lord in our Constitution before he dies. He strongly believes in repealing the 19th Amendment. He wrote a book with a white supremacist, a little pamphlet called Slavery as It Was back in the early 2000s, where he advocates that maybe slavery wasn't as bad as we thought, and maybe it was actually mutually beneficial. I'm not exaggerating. You can look this shit up. Okay. He also says to this day that being gay is way worse than having slavery in a country. This man has a church network. Pete Hegseth goes to one of his churches. Pete Hegseth reads Doug Wilson's books. The church that Pete Hegseth goes to, one of the pastors has a podcast called, get ready, The Red Pill Reformation. Pete Hegseth now runs the world's largest military, and he believes in conquest and conquering. He believes that discipling the nations looks like taking over the nations. This is why so many people in the space I exist in were freaking the hell out, because Doug Wilson is someone that has extreme views. His stuff on sex would make you vomit the way he talks about women. I mean, I won't even say it for sake of your audience. It is gross. This is the guy that Pete Hegseth says he loves his work. He reads his books. He goes to his church network. And now this guy runs our military. This is why we're freaking out. Trump is problematic for sure. He's a liar. He's a megalomaniac. He's terrible. But the Christian nationalists who have been planning this next regime, they're the dangerous ones. Pete Hegseth in this position is a massive win for these people who believe that they have an obligation to replace American civil law with the Bible.
So, all that being said, I want to ask you a question that I feel like I already know the answer to.
Okay.
How many elected officials reached out to you for subject matter expertise when they were preparing their questions for the confirmation hearings?
Oh, to me, zero. Like,
I'm
no
just
one reached
pausing.
out.
I'm literally pausing.
Okay,
People
yeah.
probably think my camera froze. It
Yeah,
didn't
are you there?
freeze.
Zero. Now, I do want to be fair. There are some really good academics doing amazing work on this front that have gotten some mainstream media coverage. I don't know if politicians have contacted them, but the work of Kristen Dumais, the work of Jamar Tisby, of Matthew Taylor, Bradley Onishi, Andrew Whitehead, they have been Robbie Jones. They've been singing this song for a long time, writing really well on it. But to your point, at least as far as I'm concerned, no one in mainstream media, in secular left-wing media, or in politics has reached out to me asking about this.
Well, and the reason I ask about the hearings in particular is because I don't know how much of them you were able to catch, but I didn't see any questions that were meant to elicit this kind of information that would be terrifying to the average American. There were questions about his drinking, which we already knew about, which a lot of people can be like, well, I drink and I get my job done,
Right.
which is right. Like people will be like, well, I'm an adulterer. I get my job done. So those things might not move the needle as much as like, this guy's ready to lead the biblical crusades and install Christofascism in every single state, and perhaps expand it to Mexico and Canada and everything else that they want to take over. So
I 100% agree. 100%. This is why. What I can do is I actually have a quote here if you want to hear it. This is from that book I was telling you about by Doug Wilson that Pete Hegseth thinks is a great leader. Here's what Doug says in his book, Southern Slavery as It Was. Quote, slavery as it existed in the South was not an adversarial relationship with pervasive racial animosity. Because of its predominantly patriarchal character, it was a relationship based upon mutual affection and confidence. There has never been a multiracial society which has existed with such mutual intimacy and harmony in the history of the world. The credit for this must go to the predominance of Christianity. The gospel enabled men who were distinct in nearly every way to live and work together, to be friends and often intimates.
I need to do like a live reaction video of you reading that.
It gets worse. He keeps going. This happened to such an extent that moderns indoctrinated on civil rights propaganda would be thunderstruck to know half of it. This man is a Southern Confederacy apologist. And Pete Hegseth goes, his work is great. I love his work. It's so good. I'll go to one of his churches that like he helped kind of, he helped build the network too. This is
Well,
who's in the White House.
what's scary to me is that this sounds shockingly similar to the Prager University video about, and we all know that part of, I can't remember if it's the chief marketing officer or who it is at PragerU, but basically wants to put the biblical worldview into all classroom curriculum as well. And so we're seeing this come at us from all angles, but the scariest angle to me is how they want to reform the education system to teach all of this.
Oh, 100. I mean, again, you want to know why the Department of Education is the main target? Read R.J. Rushdoony's work. R.J. Rushdoony hated the Department of Education. The early homeschooling movement, which by the way was actually started by a communist, radically enough, because he thought that public school was too oppressive. Props to him. Was hijacked though by white evangelicals who hated the idea of schools being integrated. Right? This starts the whole idea that maybe our public school system is trying to indoctrinate our kids. It goes against our biblical values. This stuff, once you read some history on white evangelicalism, you hear the rhyming today all over the place. So I am not surprised that the Department of Education is in the crosshairs. I'm unfortunately dismayed that they got the power to do exactly what they've been wanting to do for such a long time. But this is, again, not some imaginary, today let's go after the Department of Education. No. This has been long in the works before Trump even hopped on the scene. He's simply the pawn being used to get this stuff done.
Yeah, and the fact is they're patient, and that's one thing I've noticed. And as you mentioned, it was a 50-year plan to take down Roe v. Wade, and it sounds like they have 50-year plans to return us back to biblical times. So.
Technically, it's 200 years is the plan length, but yes, and you can look up the work of Julie Ingersoll and Angela Denker on this, who track these movements. But yeah, it's a 200-year plan. Mm-hmm.
We need a syllabus after this show. I feel like everybody's like, this is a lot of books that I'm going to have to read, but we're going to read all of them. Tim, I am so grateful for you joining us and having this conversation with us. I had like 1,000 questions that I also didn't get to, but I want to get to one that I think is key, because this conversation to me feels like a continuation of the conversation that we did have on Threads. How can people who are watching, how can people who want to make a difference, who are not from this space, not from the evangelical space, who maybe have a small platform or meeting platform, how can people get involved, and how can we work together to ensure that all of your knowledge is tapped into, that the knowledge of other people who have experienced this and grown up with this is tapped into?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, we have to work together, right? And we all have different skills and different perspectives that have to be offered as we think about and navigate this better path forward for all of us. I think that for your audience out there who maybe is listening and is like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Like, is this real? I would say just check out, the work that we offer and many others. There are people like April LaJoy. There's people like Tami Spencer Helms, an amazing Black woman who does amazing work, who grew up in white evangelicalism. There's all kinds of people out there who grew up in these spaces who are helping to sound the alarm. And then I would say from there, if you have a platform, I'd be happy to talk to anyone on their platform or on mine. And let's also talk about what I'm missing. I'm a very much still a white man working on my own decolonization. Certainly, I have a lot to learn as well, right, about other traditions and what they have to offer as we navigate the better path forward. But when it comes to the canary in the coal mine, I'm happy to be one of them, because it is a 5-alarm fire. I mean, Obergefell's on the table. There's real stuff happening. None of it is by accident. Even all of the executive orders, they're planned from the beginning to be shock and awe, to overwhelm the system. Steve Bannon, a key player in all this, said, we flood the zone with shit. Mainstream media cannot keep up with every single story. So what we do is we overwhelm, and then we kind of create a sense of panic. This is all intentional, and we need to work together in order to combat it.
Well, thank you, Tim. I feel like we're learning to swim the more we have these conversations, so they can flood the zone, but we will swim. Please check out his organization, Let's Push the Church Forward Together, the New Evangelicals. Follow Tim on all the socials. People can find you at Tim Whitaker Speaks on Instagram, and you're on Threads, and you're everywhere. So thank you again for being here. I feel like I need to do some soul searching and meditation after this one, because that was It's just like so much information to
I
take
know.
in and then to
I
also
know.
act on. And that's what we have to do. We have to get past the taking it in and into the acting on.
I share all of that. I live in this headspace all the time. It affects everything I do, including my family at times. And I'm with you. It's a lot to take in, but if we do it together, it's not so bad, you know? So
Amazing. Thank you, Tim. We will see you out there. Thank you.